we're on. Well, good afternoon, everyone, via YouTube. I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen. I'm coordinator of the UCF Judaic Studies program, and I want to welcome a special guest to our course on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Professor Zev Garber, Emeritus Professor and Chair of Jewish Studies at Los Angeles Valley College. He attended Bar Ilan University in Israel and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Hebrew from Hunter College. He studied Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and Ugaritic at UCLA Graduate School and completed his coursework for a PhD in religion at the University of Southern California. He joined the faculty at Los Angeles Valley College in 1970 and within a year established a Jewish Studies major. His scholarship embraces Jewish Studies pedagogy, Shoah, that is Holocaust theology, the Jewish Jesus, and interfaith dialogue. He has presented hundreds of academic articles and reviews and was the subject of an honorary volume published in 2009 entitled Maven in Blue Jeans. That said, we're going to turn our focus today on to the Dead Sea Scrolls and specifically what we learn in these ancient texts about the Hebrew Bible. Well, it's frequently noted that the scrolls we have involve at least fragments from each and every book of the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of the book of Esther. And when it comes to why Esther is missing from the Dead Sea corpus, we've got various explanations that have been put forth. For example, it might be due to the fact that Esther is really the only biblical book in which the name of God is never mentioned. God's name just doesn't appear in the book of Esther. Maybe that's why the book was not included by the sectarians. And for that reason, the sect may have considered it just not worthy of copying. And it's fair to ask, why was the name of God so important to the sect? Why? Why God's name? Why did it have to be spelled out that it became that vitally important that a book without it wasn't worth copying? Well, I'm sure Professor Garber has much to say about the divine name and its importance throughout Jewish history. So with that said, Professor Garber, what say ye about the name of God, about the Dead Sea Scrolls in general?
I can thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just get rid of this little interruption I have here. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say good morning to you. It's my time. It's roughly before 12 p.m. and whatever time you're listening to the record right now. I have in front of me two publications which are easily purchased in a public grocery store or chain. One is called National Geographic, The Dead Sea Scrolls, and the other is an earlier publication from Life magazine called The Dead Sea Scrolls. Both have the same title. One has the subtitle, The Race to Solve an Ancient Mystery, and the other has the subtitle, Delve into Historical Discovery. The volumes of these two journals are basically the same, though they have different points of view presented. And I'm going to present still another point of view, which is more personal, I guess, than it is academic. But before I go into any of that, let me just mention that thousands upon thousands of fragments have been found, identified in popular scholarship today as Dead Sea Scrolls, or the scrolls from a community called Qumran. Essentially, a number of caves have been discovered. Cave 1, Cave 4, Cave 3, Cave 11. The last cave, for example, is the famous temple scroll that was discovered. And the temple scroll is essentially a different variant of how to build what's said to be yet to be built, the third Jewish temple. In the case of case of cave number 1, perhaps the most famous of the manuscripts associated with the Dead Sea community is known as the Isaiah scroll. So thorough is it, it's like the full book itself, in addition to finding other fragments of the Isaiah scroll. So in cave number 1, if memory serves me correctly, among the stuff found there is Pesha Habakkuk, a commentary on a book called Habakkuk, one of the minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible. There is the full Isaiah scroll. There's also other scrolls, you might say, found therein as well. In cave number 4, there is the Manual of Discipline, and there also is the suggested fragment, which has proven to be a hoax, only discovered moments ago by me, thanks to the host, Professor Hansen. And that is a fragment of the missing book of Esther, said to be a hoax, a story. I read about it recently published, which was a part of today's presentation. Anyway, that's associated with cave number 4. Cave number 3, there is an unusual manuscript known as the Copper Scroll. Why so? It's written in some kind of gold background and has different locations, which is said to be where silver and gold are basically housed. And so different people began looking at the direction of the map found in the Copper Scroll. Well, that's in cave number 3. And so the story goes. Each one of these caves seems to produce a fragment or two, if not complete books of the so-called Hebrew Bible. I have in front of me from the Dead Sea Scrolls of National Geographic an actual chart of the text of the Hebrew Bible found in Qumran, and every book of the Hebrew Bible contain multiple copies. The book of Genesis, there are 20 copies found. Exodus, 16 copies. The book of Leviticus, the third book of the Hebrew Bible, 12. And Deuteronomy has 20, whereas Numbers has only 6 books found. And then the books of the prophets, each one of them has multiple copies of books, with exceptions of the book of 1 and 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah, Ezra, basically have 1 copy found. And the book of Esther is listed with 0 copies found. And the question of this particular discussion is, why is the book of Esther missing from the cache known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the writings of a group known as the Essenes, whose name I need to go over with you in a second. Now, Professor Hansen, in his introductory remarks, mentioned the absence of the name of God. He mentioned there's only one book that has the absence of God's name. I presume what he means by God's name is the word Elohim, which translates as God or gods, or the Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, known as the Yahweh word, the sacred name that a Jew who is observant normally would not say unless it's in ritualistic teaching or in ritual prayer. In fact, Ken and I both participated in an invited article for the Journal of Ecumenical Studies, in which I wrote a piece on religion and reason, or revelation and reason, and Ken responded to me of the comments I had to say. The book of Esther lacks the name of God. No question about that. So does another book of the Hebrew Bible lack the name of God, and that is Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. When the name of God seems to be missing, then interpretation comes in. That a word that's found here and there is really representing Hashem. Hashem is the common parlance for the Yahweh word, pronounced ritualistically as Adonai, my Lord. So the Shir HaShirim has the bride and bridegroom, where the bridegroom is seen as to be the significance of God's presence, and the bride is supposed to be Israel, the people. As far as the book of Esther is concerned, there is a phrase where Mordecai, the hero of the story, tells his young cousin, who's seen by many as a niece of Uncle Mordecai, but she's actually a younger cousin, and he says to her, help will come mimakom acher. In chapter 4 of that book of Esther, help will come from another place. Well, rabbinic tradition understands that word makom not with a small letter P, another place, but as a capital letter P. The word makom is nothing more than one of the names associated with the divine presence. That's how you take a text. A problem is asked, an answer is offered, and as far as the people who participate in the dialogue, that answer seems to be sufficient. Let me explain this a little differently. The group known as the Essenes was one of 4 groups of importance in what is known as Second Temple Judaism period. By Second Temple, I mean basically the following dates, if you're able to follow. There's a period of the exile done by the Babylonians, called the Babylonian exile in 587, 586 before the Common Era. There was a second type of exile, you might say, or first one that took place around 596. So 596 and then 587, then the fullness of that exile lasted to around 539. In 539, you had a Persian king that basically permitted the return of the Jews. And so the return from the Babylonian exile under Cyrus the Great is said to have occurred in that period of 539. By 516, 517, the Jews began to rebuild a second Jewish temple. The first was destroyed. The one associated with Solomon was destroyed in 587, let's say. And in 516, what's called the Second Temple and its construction. That's going to last all the way over to the first century and the end of the first revolt against the Romans from 66 to 70 and the Second Temple destruction. As we speak right now, there are enthusiastic Jews waiting for the rebuilding and anticipating in our lifetime the third Jewish temple, supported, I might add, by a whole group of thousands of evangelical Christians, for want of better description, known as Christian Zionists. All this is part of what I need to tell you about the groups in that period of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I took the opportunity to write down their names so it'll be easier to follow. That first group there is known as the Pharisees. If you're able to see the names, the word Pharisee, coming from a Hebrew word which means to extract, the perushim. It could mean, as it's understood by many, to be the rabbinic age, the period of rabbis who saw texts of the Torah to be difficult to understand, and so they began to interpret. Their interpretation became associated with authoritative teaching, and so the terminology of an oral Torah. It's based on a literal word of the Torah itself. God says to write the Torah, and basically you have to teach it. Well, if you write, then that's a written Torah. Torah meaning teaching. If you have to teach it, then you use your mouth to explain what exactly has to be taught. Hence the twin Torahs, you might say, the written and the oral Torah. Torah Shebiktav and the Torah Shebal Peh. The Pharisaic way of teaching Torah by oral understanding is the dominant way of how one teaches in an academic classroom, as I'll show you in a few moments. The other groups mentioned are the Sadducees. The word Sadducee, for the Hebrew word Sadukim, possibly could mean the word righteous ones. These were primarily the priesthood, and the priesthood had central control of temple sacrifices when there was the Jewish temple. The group known as the Essenes is the group associated with the Dead Sea material. Scholars now are of the opinion that Dead Sea material was not written in one period by one group of scholars or writers, but over a period of time, with the Essene community said to establish itself somewhere in that third pre-Christian century, and basically coming to an end, all seem to agree on this, in the year 68, 2 years before the end of that first revolt against the Romans, which ended in the year 70. Keep in mind that year 68. Keep in mind that the Essene community essentially was established several centuries before. And also that word is seen in Hebrew, known as the Hasidim, the pious ones. Their main characteristic, according to traditions about them, is that they separated from the Hellenistic and later Roman culture that dominated mainland Jerusalem and areas of that area and areas around Jerusalem, around Jerusalem. They felt it was too acculturated or too assimilated. They believed in a very pious dictation of Torah and the Torah way as they understood it. They were a separatist in that sense. And keep in mind that distinction. Separation of a text to understand it better is the Pharisaic way. Separation from other people who were assimilated was the Essene way. And then you had those with the swords, the so-called zealots, the Sicarii, the bearers of this dagger, as it were. who believed in a nationalism and a freedom from the oppressing groups, whether they are the Hellenistic group or whether they are the Roman group. They are the ones responsible for the revolt, you might say. And their last stand is said to be Har Matsada, mountain known as Masada, that particular mountain, which is very sign of Jewish independence and fight to death for independence. What is unusual is that one of the Essene community's Dead Sea Scrolls was actually found on top of Mount Masada. How to explain a separatist group from a contact with a group that bears a sword? At the end, they found a remnant of the scrolls of the Dead Sea on top of Mount Masada. I'll attempt an answer soon. Let me now give you the way in which Torah was read. Was this the way in which the Essenes read the Torah back in the day? I don't know. I do know that they had manuscripts such as the War Scroll of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. The Sons of Darkness was probably not an outside group, but rather an inner group within greater Judaism of that time. It could well have been the Pharisees. It could well have been the Sadducees. It was not necessarily the Greeks or the Romans. And the teacher of righteousness essentially represented the Essene way of understanding Torah. How much more so when it came to the temple structure itself, as the temple scroll seems to imply a complete different architectural design than what was given in what is known as the traditional first and second temple. That's how people interpret. There's a manual of discipline. There's a way in which you count your holidays. The Essene community, for example, in Leviticus chapter 23, speaks about Macharat Shabbat, on the morrow of the Sabbath, is how they count from Passover to Pentecost. So do the Sadducees count that way. So do Christians count that way. Whereas the Pharisaic tradition, influencing rabbinic tradition to this very day, understands the morrow of the Shabbat not to be Sabbath as a seventh day, but a Sabbath as a day of rest. Whenever Pesach comes, then on that morrow you start carrying things. So it could be well from Saturday night, Sunday, to another 7 weeks later on a Sunday. Or Passover this year comes out during the week. That's when you start counting down to the holiday known as Pentecost. It's again interpretation. But I think the one sentence that basically sets the whole mood of how Essenes, the Dead Sea material, would see a text of the Bible is how I'm going to interpret chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, sentence number 1. If I were to look at the actual text received today in the Pharisaic tradition, for want of a better name, I have the phrase Breshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et. My Hebrew Bible is the same as the Genesis volumes found in the Dead Sea material. There are no vowels. You're going to have to read in the vowels. That very first word is beginning of, and something is lacking. Beginning of what? The next word is created. The third word is God. I might just say beginning of God, and if that's so, then who creates God? In Hebrew biblical tradition, a verb before a subject is possible for the third person for the purpose of emphasis. God created. That word creation is monumental. Hence, you don't have Elohim bara, but you have bara Elohim. But that doesn't explain why the missing construction of creation of what? It has a word missing. And then it says the heaven and earth. And that phrase heaven and earth is introduced by a preposition rather than a direct object marker, with the heaven and with the earth. And so I can make a big deal about that. On the other hand, you have those who say there are two alternate readings. One is eight, one is et. What difference does it make? It means the heaven and the earth. And it means Elohim, God as God, which has a plural marker, by the way, suggesting maybe gods rather than a singular God, which is how we Christians read that word. The triunity is why it's Elohim and why there's a plural marker. See how the thing is interpreted? But with the word Bereshit, there is another tradition, and that's the Pharisaic way of dealing with it. By Pharisaic, I mean rabbinic way. I have in my hand, at least I had it moments ago, the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs, essentially chapter number 8, here it is, has the story of creation. Yes, the creation story is not just found in Genesis, but in the book of Proverbs, we're told how wisdom is created. And in particularly chapter 8, there is reference that wisdom is the very first thing God creates before there is heaven, before there's earth, before there's wind, before there's ocean, before there's anything. God creates wisdom. And with that wisdom, we have that word reshit. To be more specific, let me find that sentence so that I don't read out of context. The sentence in itself has God created with wisdom. Let me just find chapter number 8. Just bear with me a second. All right, I have chapter 8 in front of me right now. It's chapter 6. That tells you how bad my eyesight is. Okay, here's chapter 8. And if I don't find the sentence right away, here it is. It's chapter 8, sentence number 20. I guess sentence number 20. It's hard for me to see here. In any case, the actual verse says, the Lord Kanani. It says here in English, the Lord made me as the beginning of his way, the first of his works of old. The Lord made me Reshit Darko, beginning of his way, the first of his acts of creation. That's that word Reshit. Reshit means beginning of. It's also used in Proverbs chapter 8 as a phrase synonymous with the word wisdom. With that understood, the Pharisaic method goes back to chapter 1, sentence 1, and the word bereshit means with reshit, God created. Let's try to understand that. With wisdom, God created heaven and earth. Get it? Without this context, you're confused. I'm confused. We're all confused. That's where interpretation, that's where a drush comes in. That's where association comes in. That's why the Jews maintain in the Pharisaic tradition there's neither before nor after. Everything is somehow linked together. And I might add, in your Hebrew class at the UCF, you're probably taught the lesson there's no such thing as a present tense. The present tense doesn't exist. The avar and the atid are joined together. You have an example right here.
The past and
God
the
created,
present of our and
and
that's
wisdom
past
comes
and
in.
present.
That's it. That's it. What about the Essenes? I have no idea how they understood that first sentence. I suspect they might have had a similar way of looking at it. I don't know. But that's the beauty of the challenge.
But this whole methodology of interpretation is really critical to understand because modern folks today really don't get it much of the time. You just read
Right.
the Bible and you just try to take it for granted. This is what the Bible says, end of story. But this is
Exactly.
not the rabbinical way. It's not the Jewish way. It's not the Pharisaic way, which was to pick apart every single word of that text, every single letter, and try to imagine what other ways it might be understood. Every word is pregnant with possibility and 1,000 different interpretations. And we find this all through rabbinic literature, where it might mean this, it might mean that. Let's debate what these possible meanings might be. But the amazing thing is to find this same type of interpretation already developing among the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a whole library of material involving specific interpretations of the biblical text, which modern people would see as completely far-fetched. But not so when we understand that this is the Pharisaic way. This is the Jewish way. You can read
Okay.
anything into a text.
All right, let me go a step further than that. First of all, I agree with what you're saying, Ken. But the issue is how do people follow a certain way? And I guess now I want to get more into the Essenes themselves. Essentially, they are living in a period of time. They choose to separate away. They live among themselves in what's called the area of Qumran. They live in the lowest spot on earth, according to what I understand about the Dead Sea area. They live in Midbar Yehuda, is the Hebrew terminology, the wilderness of Judah. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are known as the Megillot, the scrolls from the wilderness of Judah. The Essenes also have their own particular interpretation. They are messianic oriented. They truly believe that in their lifetime, I mean that in a more literal than interpretive sense, a messianic age will take place. Keep that in mind and keep also in mind a development known as the early Christians. The notion of a messianic redeemer or redemption will take place. How much more so when you have a situation in the second pre-Christian century of which you have the Maccabean revolt, where you have a pleasant story where the temple is now cleansed and a miracle of oil that's burned for one night goes for 8 nights, and all stories like that. The book of the Maccabees, of which I might add are excluded from the traditional Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, and yet seen as responsible for a minor holiday so much major now in America and the European world, known as the holiday of Hanukkah. The story of chapter 1 of the Maccabees, chapter 1, rather book 1, chapter 2, where you have Mattathias in effect, suggesting a revolt against the Hellenistic presence that's there, where there is a Hellenistic Jew who offers a sacrifice, and he himself is going to be sacrificed by Mattathias, the priest of that area, who basically does not permit a sacrificial idolatrous offering. You have what's called the Maccabean Revolt. And the Maccabean Revolt has the following: Mattathias, who kills and takes the sword and says, we follow in the tradition of Pinchas. Pinchas is a story mentioned in Numbers chapter 25, who takes a sword in hand and gets rid of a Jew of the day who intermarries with a foreigner. And so the sword is identified with the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean revolt. And the word Maccabee itself is a strange word. According to folk tradition that I'm aware of, the word Maccabee is nothing more than an acronym of 4 words found in Exodus chapter 15 of all places. A song at the sea, Az Yashir Moshe V'nei Israel. When you cross that sea of reeds, or the Red Sea known to many people, there's a song that's sung. Thus sang Moses and the children of Israel. And somewhere in that chapter 15 of Exodus is the phrase, Micha Mocha Ba'ilim Hashem. Who is like you among the gods, among the gods, among the gods, O Lord? The recognition that there are other gods is not foreign to the Hebrew Bible. The recognition of a singular God for Israel is the great teaching. That singular God, eventually known as the universal God. But if you take the first letters of Micha Mocha by Elim Hashem, you spell out the word Maccabee. So in a sense, a revolt against the Greek culture, that's what you have there. And essentially the victory of the sword of Judah. Judah Maccabeus is then succeeded by one of his brothers, Jonathan. And then there's another brother, Simon. There are 5 sons of Mattathias. And according to tradition, Jonathan basically makes a move unheard of and definitely dissociated with the Essenes. He took the statehood of the Maccabee victory and united it with the high priesthood. They were a priestly family, but they were not of the Kohen HaGadol, not of the high priest.
They were
That
not
is
the
a
sons of Tzadok.
That's right.
And what I find fascinating is that the term Sadducees, Tzedukim, is related linguistically to Tzadok. And so you had the Zadokite priesthood that had been ruling in Jerusalem up until Jonathan assumed the high priesthood inappropriately, to say the least. He was not
That's
a
right.
member of the right priestly family. What happened to the sons of Tzadok at that time? So there's even a theory that a branch of the Zadokites, this is Professor Schiffman's theory, must have gone out and withdrawn to the shores of the Dead Sea and established a community which was basically a Sadducean community. He finds connections between the Dead Sea sect and the Sadducees. So
All
there's
right.
endless
But that
speculation.
only that
And
only
and one
go ahead.
one more thing, because there's so much debate about who these people were, has to do,
Right.
mentioned repeatedly, the Pharisees, who were interpreters. We get the word pirush, which is an interpretation, which is what you've been doing here with how do we interpret the Bereshit, bara, Elohim, and so on. But there's another term, another verb behind it. Parash means to withdraw, as if to retire. Today in Israel, if we say ani poresh, it means I'm retiring. Lifrosh is to retire. And we find a key document among the scrolls called MMT, Miktzat Maaseh Torah, a few of the precepts of the Torah, just a fragmentary text pieced together, but according to scholarship, may well have been written by the teacher of righteousness himself, the founder of the text. And what he says clearly in that document, and I'll cite the document, he says, Va'atem yodeim, and you know, he's speaking to all the people, whoever he's writing to, ki parashnu mirov ha'am, that we have withdrawn from the majority of the people. He's explaining why the sect withdrew to begin with, why it formed. And what's the key word there? Parashnu, parash, we have withdrawn. So there are those who also can make a real case that this may have been a branch of the Pharisee party, something like an ancient Pharisaic Chavurah, descended from the ancient Hasidim, which withdrew from the people. So who are they? Are they the Pharisees? Are they the Sadducees? Are they
Well,
the Zealots? And you
right.
yeah, you mentioned already a fragments found on top of Masada. And of course, the Essenes, who may have been, according to some, sort of an umbrella parent group who spawned several other groups beneath them, including, among
Mhm.
others, the Jesus movement. So that's the whole can of
Exactly.
worms that we open up that is endlessly fascinating.
All right, well, take what you're saying. I certainly agree with all of it, in fact. And basically, when you talk about the Christianity part, if I understand history correctly, the Essenes, let's use that terminology, come to an end in 68. You have basically at this time now the Roman conquest, in which you have Vespasian, you have Titus, who's going to succeed him, and you also have Nero before, in which you have the end, so to speak, of the Essenes based on what fact? Based on, from what I've read and researched, coins associated with the Qumran community are said to be the last things that they can use for dating around the year 68. What then happens to this community? They disperse. You don't hear from them.
Mhm.
And some are said to have gone up to Masada, which might explain why there is an Essene document up there, one of the scrolls, and others conceivably become part of what's called the early Christian party. Why the
Fragments
Christian
of the
party?
Song of Sabbath sacrifices, we should add, were
Okay.
found on top of Matzadah. And the Song of Sabbath sacrifice is the most ancient Kabbalistic Jewish mystical text ever to have been discovered, which we're actually
All right. There's
studying
another
up
piece of
north right
evidence
now.
which I'm not aware of. But the whole idea is that events is what determines how a person thinks. Events are what determines how a group begins to orient itself. And essentially, what seems so strange is not so. And you see parallels today with the state of Israel, the current situation in Gaza, which way to go, demonstrations in Tel Aviv, bring the hostages home, and the ability to somehow eliminate as best as possible what is seen to be the trouble behind this, and that's the Hamas situation. Meanwhile, the Jewish people are again being called and vilified, and it's not just in the streets, it's in the universities as well, where administration buildings are taken over, pro-Palestinian positions are taken, all of which is conceivable. But this is very much a parallel to what can be seen to what had happened 2,000 or so years ago. As far as the Essene community is concerned, and maybe one of the reasons why the book of Esther is not there is who the hell are you going to celebrate as your hero? According to Pharisaic Jewish tradition, you have, you are to adlo yada, you are to drink that wine of yours and be happy until you cannot distinguish between blessed Mordecai and cursed Haman.
And
Well,
that's
what
how
if
we get the
Mordecai
mitzvah
happens
on
to be a
the Feast
villain?
of Purim. That's how we get the mitzvah on the Feast of Purim, which we commemorate to celebrate Esther.
Understood, but understand now Garber's position. If this book of Esther is meant to be a Jewish book, then why is Esther known by Esther? That's an assimilated name. Keep that one name, Shoshana, which is mentioned in the very first chapter, I believe, of the book of Esther. And that guy, Mordecai, why the hell is he called Marduk? Why don't you have a Hebrew name by Mordecai? And right away, you have two inclinations with the absence of the actual name of God, the Shem Mephorash, that may well say that this book is really an assimilated book. It really doesn't deal with us, even though the story has the Jewish survival and the Jewish dominance at the end. The book of Esther is full of Persian imagery.
Mhm.
Take the word not, that word that means today religion, is not a Hebrew word. It's a good Persian word that somehow defines the Jews under the Persian Empire with Cyrus as people of legalism. That word not. You have the word Purim itself, that word Pur, the county of the lot. That word is also not Hebrew. It's an assimilated, acculturated book, which we Jews in our diaspora can certainly identify with. On the other hand, if you find yourself to be an isolationist, how can you possibly want to be identified with it? Take the current state of Florida. As I speak right now, in the last couple of hours, the NAACP has already given suggestion to Black athletes do not apply to any university in Florida. For what reason? Is there discrimination against Black athletes? But there is the elimination of a DEA program, that type of stuff. And so don't go to Florida. See what happens? People are affected by events as they interpret these particular events, which may or may not be accurate.
And
And in the
there's
book of
another
Esther,
there's
wait a
another
second,
aspect. Okay,
but
there's another aspect of Esther that I'm thinking about even as we're talking here, and that has to do with the violent imagery in the book that the Jews, of course, they're vindicated, they're saved in the end, but what do? They slaughter all of their enemies. That's a violent type of image, which even today in Judaism is de-emphasized, which is one of the reasons that people are supposed to make merry and have fun and drink so that they can't distinguish between Esther and Mordecai. We're not taking it that seriously as if to minimize the violent aspect of this book. Could that have something to do also with the fact that it doesn't appear among the Dead Sea Scrolls? And since we're talking about the Maccabees, I should also mention that the ancient Hasidim originally joined the Maccabean revolt against the Syrians, against the wicked king Antiochus. But after the temple had been rescued, after Jerusalem had been retaken, they dropped out of the revolt. And why is that? Because apparently they did not particularly care for the continuation of the violence. We're in it as long as we have a religious motivation, but a military, violent orientation, that's not for us. And
okay.
even in the book of Maccabees, I'm just now studying a very interesting passage which it cryptically references the Hasidim, but it says, and they shall provide a little help. That's actually in the book of Daniel. It talks about a little help, and we know the references to the Maccabees. Why a little help? Because they didn't like violence. And it could well be that the Dead Sea sect also had this anti-violent attitude. Maybe they were an offshoot of this Hasidic sect which withdrew because they didn't want the violence.
Okay, let me respond in all the different ways. First of all, the book of Maccabees is not a celebrated book in the Hebrew Bible. Secondly, not all Jews, contemporary Jews, even take the holiday of Hanukkah seriously. They find it to be what you're suggesting, a violent type of memory, even though we see it, at least I see it, as something victorious, the cleansing of the temple. But following Mattathias and following Judah Maccabeus, you basically have a distortion of the role of the priesthood, which can well be one of the reasons why. Or the fact that a sword is taken to get the victory and necessary for self-defense. For some Jews, that's that. Like take today's situation, that's required. It's requisite. It's not something you design. It's something that gives you self-protection. Then we can talk about a peaceful coexistence, etc. But before then, there is no such thing as peaceful coexistence, as the enemy will do what it does if you don't protect yourself. Self-protection, whatever means necessary. As far as the story of Jews eliminating the dot, the dot, the dot, even if you take it as historically factual, the enemy of the book of Esther is a fellow by the name of Haman, who's basically of the descendants of Agag. Agag is mentioned as that particular king in 2 Samuel chapter 15, where the prophet Samuel says to Saul, the first king of Israel, "You now lost your kingship. But I did everything against the Amalekites." Agag is of a people called the Amalek. Zachor Masha Salacha Amalek, found in Deuteronomy, whereby the wiping out of a group known as the Amalekites, who basically attacked Israel on the way out of Egypt and stuff of that nature. So the Amalek is the equivalent, if I can use the phrase, of a Nazi personified today. The elimination is required. And I guess that is why a book of Esther has that story that you mentioned. But it also has something else, Professor, and that is Mityahadim. Of all books of the Hebrew Bible, only once do you actually have a word that deals with taking on Judaism. The Hityahed is the contemporary term to convert to Judaism. The word Yehudi is mentioned specifically in that book of Esther. And Gentiles mityahadim is such an issue now as I speak, that there are thousands upon thousands of Gentiles for Torah as they get into Torah. They don't simply see it as Christians anymore, but they see it as potential converts into Judaism. Take, for example, a factual statement. 22% of all of Latin America is said to have a Jewish DNA. It blows me away when I hear this, except to know something about history. The conversos, the Inquisition, those who chose to be Christians so they could stay in their lands of Portugal and Spain and the colonies, and now discovering a Jewish DNA and some returning. This is what goes on. And I guess the Essenes themselves, if they truly believed in a messianic redemption, if their teacher righteousness was unknown to us, but let's assume a figure of importance, is not fulfilled in their own way of seeing things, then the party that's closest to them among greater Jews of that day is the Christian movement. And it will not shock me to find that some of them wind up as Christians. And then the following statement: it's in the Catholic Church that Judah Maccabeus is a saint. It's in the Catholic Bible that the book of the Maccabees is part of the sacred scripture. Is Judah Maccabeus a Christian? I doubt it. And yet Christianity and all its delving into the Hebrew scripture now demands to be recognized as part of the Jewish expression of that first century. And with fellow Jews, welcome them. There's going to be a publication by the Association of Jewish Studies that's going to come out in December, which has the unusual topic, conversion. I can't wait to see the articles that will go into it. Ken?
You've nailed it, Zeb. Yeah,
I can go further. Do you want, or do we have time on this?
um, we always have a few more minutes if you have anything
Okay,
to add. But really, I am thrilled to be able to chat like this. And this is what we do in scholarship. We don't just
exactly.
cite information. I'm always telling our students this, and we have ideas that we toss out there, but then we sit and we debate and discuss. And maybe this is the case. Maybe we have some other angle here that we can go into. The whole idea of authorship is hotly debated in scholarship, and we've touched on some of the prospects today. The zealot link. I just mentioned the possibility of a nonviolent, quasi-pacifist link. Well, how does that fit with the fact that we've got scrolls found on top of Masada? There are no easy answers. There are just theories, possibilities, things that we toss out there, and somehow it all interlinks. But we need good communication skills, and the opportunity which Zoom now allows us to bring in other renowned scholars, so that our class doesn't think that it's just a monotone voice here teaching. This is something that we collaborate on as scholars, and scores, hundreds, yea, thousands of scholars get together and talk on these very subjects at scholarly conferences, conventions. This is what we do. So I want to encourage all of our students and whoever's listening to dig in further and to have a stake in it. Whenever I tell students to write a paper, I say, don't just give us information. I'm not looking for an encyclopedia article. Have an opinion, have a scholarly opinion, have a stake in what you're writing, and then it means something. So I want to thank you again, Zev, for being here. Go ahead.
1 second. I'd like to add a footnote. You're going to be shocked. It will take 1 minute. The scrolls themselves, the first ones were found in 1947. They eventually were purchased by the father of Yigal Yadin, responsible for the temple scroll, responsible for so many other accomplishments. Masada, for example, the first, he was also the head of the Israel Defense Forces in 1948. The story is shocking. The first three scrolls that the state of Israel, yet to be established May 14, 1948, were purchased in 1947. Sukhanik, the father of Yigal Yadin, made a phone call to a man whose name I know very well, Harry Orlinsky. Harry Orlinsky's biography, autobiography, whatever you want to call it, Zev Garber wrote for the Encyclopedia Judaica. Harry Orlinsky and I met many times at the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, National Association of Professors of Hebrew. We didn't talk scholarship together, we talked baseball. New York Yankees and figures, and the language was in Yiddish so that nobody would understand us. These are true statements. Orlinsky was asked by Yigal Yadin to take $250,000, go to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, and purchase 3 manuscripts. Don't say anything about your background, have the money ready, and indeed the manuscripts were waiting. In fact, part of it was missing as a pesha of the commentary on Habakkuk that was sent eventually by the Orthodox monastery in Jerusalem that had ownership of these monasteries, of these manuscripts.
Right.
Why am I telling you this story? The deal was made on November 27th, 1947. On that very day, the United Nations made the decision for the establishment of the State of Israel.
How about that?
A messianic fulfillment
A
in
messianic
a very
fulfillment.
unusual way.
Amen.
Factual story.
Thank you so
It's a
much again.
fact.
We shall talk again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.